The chronometer on the reinforced concrete wall of briefing room 1 clicked to 0047. In the perpetual damp twilight of the Wolfsschanze, the air was dead. It smelled of cold cement, ozone from the overworked electrical systems, and the sharp, acrid scent of fear disguised as sweat. General Kurt Zeitzler, the newly appointed chief of the Army General Staff, stood ramrod straight beside the large oak situation table. In his hands, he clutched a simple, leather-bound folder. Its contents were not paper and ink, they were live explosives. 72 hours earlier, his predecessor, the meticulous General Franz Halder, had been dismissed for nervous exhaustion. The real crime was truth-telling. Now, in the dead of this September night in 1942, Zeitzler, a loyal National Socialist, a believer in the Führer, but first and foremost a General Staff officer trained to worship facts, was about to commit the same professional suicide. The other men in the room were statues, avoiding the gaze of Medusa. Colonel General Alfred Jodl, Chief of Operations for the Armed Forces High Command, studied the grain of the wooden table as if it held the secrets of the universe. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, the obsequious La Keitel, shifted his weight silently from one polished boot to another. Hitler's military adjutants, Major Gerhard Engel and Colonel Nikolaus von Below, were frozen sentinels by the steel door. They had all seen the same signals traffic, heard the same thinly veiled panic in the encoded messages from army group commanders at the front. They all knew what was in Zeitzler's folder. It was not a briefing. It was a coroner's report for an army that was, on all the official maps, still very much alive and advancing. The door hissed open on well-oiled hinges. Adolf Hitler entered, followed by his shadow, valet Heinz Guderian. The Führer wore his plain grey tunic, the Iron Cross First Class, his only concession to decoration. His face was a pale, waxy mask under the harsh fluorescence designed to combat the bunker's gloom. A faint, persistent tremor danced in his left hand, a side effect of the daily cocktail of glucose, steroids and opiates administered by Dr. Theodor Morell. But his eyes, the famous, mesmeric blue-grey eyes, were terrifyingly alert. They scanned the room like twin searchlights, probing for the first crack of doubt, the first hint of defeatism. He did not greet them. He did not sit. He moved to the head of the table and placed both hands flat on the surface, his knuckles bleaching white against the dark wood. "Zeitzler," he said, his voice a low, gravelly monotone that vibrated with suppressed fury. "It is past midnight. You have interrupted the only period I have for rest and strategic contemplation. This had better correspond to a crisis of existential magnitude for the Reich." The temperature in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees. Zeitzler, a man built like a bulldog, famed for his boundless energy, felt a void open in the pit of his stomach. He cleared his throat, the sound catastrophically loud in the silence. "My Führer," he began, his voice tighter, drier than usual. "I have convened this meeting because the operational situation on the Eastern Front has developed in a manner that the standard daily summaries can no longer accurately encapsulate. The dispatches from Army Groups A, B and Centre over the past 96 hours indicate not a setback, but a fundamental and catastrophic shift in the strategic balance." Hitler's head cocked slightly, like a predator hearing an unfamiliar sound. "A shift," he interrupted, the word dripping with sarcasm. "We are in the final assault on Stalingrad. Our mountain troops are in the Caucasus. What shift?" Zeitzler did not look away. He opened the folder, the sound of the clasp popping like a small arms shot. "The shift, my Führer, from offensive conquest to imminent systemic collapse. I must report that we are facing not a local difficulty, but a strategic catastrophe of the first order." He let the word hang in the chemically purified, recirculated air. Catastrophe. Every man in the room stopped breathing. This was the breach. This was the shattering of the glass bell jar of optimism that had encased the wolf's lair all summer. This was the night the Eastern Front died, and Adolf Hitler would be forced to sit in this concrete tomb and watch its death throes in real time, a prisoner of the truth he had spent 3 years running from. To understand the thermonuclear shock of Zeitzler's declaration, one must rewind to the intoxicating, hubristic summer of 1942. After the bloody repulse at Moscow's gates in December 1941, Hitler had taken personal command of the army, dismissing the cautious Field Marshal Walter von Brauchitsch. He was now the supreme warlord, the größter Feldherr aller Zeiten, greatest commander of all time. Gröfas, his generals whispered behind his back with bitter irony. For the 1942 campaign, he scrapped the general staff's prudent plans. His intuition, that infallible inner voice, demanded a southern offensive. The objective was not Moscow, but economic strangulation. Seize the oil fields of the Caucasus, Maykop, Grozny, Baku, and capture Stalingrad, severing the Volga, the USSR's main artery for oil and supplies from the south. Operation Blue commenced on June 28, 1942. Its opening phase was a masterpiece of tactical motion. German and Allied armies shattered the Soviet southwestern and southern fronts. The Russian steppe, vast and seemingly defenseless, lay open. Panzer divisions under generals like Hoth and Kleist raced forward 30, even 50 miles a day, churning the earth into colossal, choking dust clouds visible from the air for 100 miles. The world's press spoke of an unstoppable German juggernaut. In the Wolf's Lair, the mood was triumphalist. On July 23rd, flushed with apparent success, Hitler issued Führer Directive No. 45, a document of breathtaking overreach. It split Army Group South in two. Army Group A, under Field Marshal Wilhelm List, was to conquer the entire Caucasus and capture the oil fields. Army Group B, under General Maximilian von Weichs, was to take Stalingrad and secure the Volga line. The two army groups would advance on diverging axes, their flanks growing longer, their forces increasingly diluted, like a man trying to stretch his arms in opposite directions until his shoulders dislocate. This confidence was built on a foundation of sand, catastrophic intelligence failure. The German intelligence branch for the East, Fremde Heere Ost, FHO, under the ambitious Colonel Reinhard Gehlen, was producing a work of fiction. Gehlen's reports, which Hitler studied with religious fervor, systematically underestimated Soviet strength. A July 1942 FHO assessment claimed the Red Army had only 1.2 million combat-effective troops remaining and that its tank production had collapsed. The reality, hidden behind the Ural Mountains, was monstrous. Soviet factories, safe from Luftwaffe bombers, were producing over 2,000 tanks per month. The Red Army had not 40, but over 160 fresh rifle divisions in reserve armies, the Stavka reserves, being trained and equipped. The German advance was not shattering a brittle enemy, it was stretching a giant, resilient spring to its absolute limit. The logistical reality was a silent, screaming nightmare. The Wehrmacht was operating at the end of a 1,200-mile supply line, the longest in military history. The single railway line from Warsaw to the Don Bend had to be painstakingly converted from the Soviet broad gauge to the European standard, a bottleneck that created mountains of stranded supplies. Of the 70 trainloads of materiel required daily to sustain the twin offensives, a mere 20 to 25 were getting through. Divisions reported critical shortages of everything: fuel, ammunition, spare parts, even bread. The victorious panzer divisions often sat idle for days, their machines silent, waiting for fuel trucks that never came. The infantry marched in the infernal summer dust, then the autumn mud, their boots wearing through, their morale eroding faster than the souls. The grand offensive was advancing on fumes, willpower, and a lie. And in Moscow, Stalin and his generals, particularly the cold, ruthless Georgy Zhukov, were not planning a mere defense. They were preparing a trap of continental scale. The stage was not set for a German triumph, but for the greatest and most humiliating, defeating German military history. And the man in the wolf's lair, staring at maps colored with wishful arrows, was the last person on earth to see it coming. 3 men, embodying 3 collapsing pillars of the German war effort, now faced each other in the electric tension of the bunker. Adolf Hitler, the prophet in the bunker. By September 1942, the Führer was a man physically and psychologically divorcing from the world he sought to conquer. The dynamic orator of the 1930s was gone, replaced by a suspicious, mercurial, and often lethargic recluse. His health, managed by the quackery of Dr. Morell, was failing. He suffered from intense stomach cramps, insomnia, and a progressive Parkinsonian tremor. But more dangerous was the ossification of his mind. His strategic thinking had hardened into dogma. Willpower conquered material. Retreat was the first step to rout. Holding ground was a moral imperative. He trusted his intuition, a gut feeling shaped by the trench warfare of 1918 and a racist belief in Slavic inferiority, over any map or casualty list presented by his cowardly generals. He saw himself as a historical titan, a figure of destiny for whom the normal laws of logistics and manpower did not apply. Tonight, he was a prophet about to be presented with forensic evidence that his prophecy was false. General Kurt Zeitzler, the loyalist confronting the abyss. Zeitzler was Hitler's personal choice to replace Halder, a tough, energetic, seemingly unshakable officer who had excelled as a chief of staff at corps and army level. He was a can-do man, promoted for his drive and loyalty, not his strategic genius. Hitler believed he had found a technocrat who would execute orders without the wearying pessimism of the Prussian aristocracy. But Zeitzler was, at his core, a product of the general staff system, where facts were holy. He had thrown himself into the job with ferocious energy, famously losing over 50 pounds in his first month from stress and overwork. He had demanded and received the raw, unvarnished data from the front, and that data had broken him. The loyalist was now the bearer of news so terrible it threatened to destroy the very leader he sought to save. His loyalty was now at war with his duty to the truth. The strain was visible. The energetic bulldog now had the eyes of a man staring into a headlight. The ghost of Heinz Guderian, the absent truth-teller. Though not physically in the room that night, the spirit of General Heinz Guderian, the father of the German blitzkrieg, haunted the proceedings. Guderian had been dismissed by Hitler in December 1941 for the cardinal sin of conducting a tactical retreat to save his panzer army from annihilation at Moscow, a precise preview of the conflict now consuming the high command. His philosophy was the antithesis of Hitler's. Warfare was fluid, ground was expendable, but the army, the professional core of men and machines, was sacred. His absence was a deafening silence, a constant reminder of the professional soldiers Hitler had purged for speaking truth. In the room, however, stood his ideological proxies in spirit, men who knew Guderian was right, and opposing them was Colonel General Alfred Jodl, Hitler's strategic parrot from the OKW, a man who had long since sacrificed his independent judgment to become a mere amplifier for the Führer's fantasies, translating delusion into operational orders. This was the cast, the deluded prophet, the broken loyalist, the ghost of rational strategy, and the sycophant. Together they formed a perfect mechanism for catastrophe. Zeitzler knew words were useless. He began with the cartography of disaster. He nodded to an aide who unfurled not the familiar propaganda map with bold arrows plunging deep into the Caucasus, but the General Staff's Lager Ost, Situation East, map. This was the truth, drawn in stark lines and symbols. The line representing the Eastern Front was not a confident, forward-thrusting blade. It was a thin, meandering, and in places dangerously broken thread. In the north, around Leningrad and the Rzhev salient, It bulged in grotesque, stagnant curves, not symbols of conquest, but of massive, static battles of attrition that were consuming divisions like a meat grinder. At Stalingrad, the line dissolved into a confused spiderweb of red and blue scribbles, denoting house-to-house fighting, a devouring maze. But Zeitzler's pointer did not go there first. Instead, it landed hundreds of miles to the northwest, on the long, graceful arc of the Don River, north of Stalingrad. "My Führer," Zeitzler said, his pointer tapping the map. "The northern flank of Army Group B. It is held not by German divisions, but by our allies. Here the Hungarian Second Army, here the Italian Eighth Army, and here the Romanian Third and Fourth Armies. This front stretches for nearly 400 kilometers. These armies are, with all due respect, militarily inadequate for this task. They are under strength, poorly equipped with anti-tank guns, and their morale is brittle. This flank is not a defensive line. It is an invitation for a Soviet breakthrough." He then laid the first document on the table beside the map, the Casualty and Strength Report. The numbers were not losses, they were an amputation. Since the start of Blau, the German army in the east had suffered over 200,000 permanent casualties, killed, missing, permanently wounded. The replacement stream was a pathetic trickle. The elite Grossdeutschland division was at 45% of its infantry strength. The entire Sixth Army, embroiled in Stalingrad, had already lost more men in the city's outskirts than in the entire 1940 campaign in the West. The report stated coldly, the average infantry division's combat strength is between 40% and 60% of its established complement. No full-strength divisions exist east of the Dnieper River. Next came the logistics and supply abstract. The numbers defied belief. The requirement for Army Groups A and B was 1,200 tons of supplies per division per day. The system was delivering less than 300. Fuel reserves were at 8% of the mandated level. Ammunition for artillery was being rationed to 5 rounds per gun per day in non-critical sectors. The railway network was so congested and damaged that supply trains were taking an average of 18 days to travel from Warsaw to the Don front. The report concluded with a sentence that was a death knell. The offensive capability of the mechanized formations is, for the immediate future, extinguished. Finally, Zeitzler placed the armored strength inventory on top. This was the most damning document of all. It listed not the paper strength of panzer divisions, but the number of operational tanks actually available at the front. The mighty 4th Panzer Army, tasked with supporting the Stalingrad assault, had 24 battle-ready tanks. The entire Army Group B, holding a front of hundreds of miles, fielded fewer than 200 operational tanks. The report included a frantic note from a panzer regiment commander at the front. "Without fuel and spare parts, our panzers are not weapons. They are immobile, steel coffins." Hitler had been silent, staring at the map, then at the documents, then back at the map. His face showed no expression. It was as if he was reading a technical manual for a machine he did not recognize. The data was not connecting. The fantasy of the summer was colliding with the arithmetic of autumn, and in the silent bunker you could almost hear the screech of tearing metal. The silence was finally broken, not by Zeitzler, but by a voice from the side of the room. It was General Adolf Heusinger, chief of the operations branch of the General Staff, a brilliant and respected planner. He could no longer contain himself. "My Führer," Heusinger said, his voice calm but edged with a desperation he couldn't fully mask. "The reports from the 48th Panzer Corps on the Don flank are unequivocal. Soviet reconnaissance probes are increasing in strength and frequency. They are not testing us, they are mapping us. Their artillery registration fire grows more accurate by the day. All the signs of a major offensive preparation are there. New railheads being built behind their lines, intercepted radio traffic indicating the movement of fresh guard armies, prisoners speaking of huge stockpiles." Hitler turned his head slowly, like a turret. "Signs?" Interpretations, he snapped. The Russian is beaten. He is launching local counterattacks to relieve pressure on Stalingrad, nothing more. This is the last convulsion of a dying beast. His voice began to rise, gaining the familiar, hectoring rhythm of the barracks lawyer. Where is your will to fight? Where is the National Socialist spirit? These numbers, he gestured contemptuously at Zeitzler's reports, are the excuses of men who have already decided in their hearts that they have lost. This was the trigger. Zeitzler, his loyalty now fully consumed by his duty to the army, slammed his hand flat on the table. The crash made everyone jump. Mein Führer! The words were not shouted, but they were carved from stone. With respect, this is not about will. This is about physics. A division at 40% strength cannot hold a 20-kilometer front against a full-strength Soviet rifle corps. A flank held by Romanian cavalry divisions with 37mm pop guns cannot withstand an assault by T-34 tanks. We are not facing convulsions. We are facing the concentrated might of the entire Red Army, which we have consistently and catastrophically underestimated. He was now speaking the unspeakable. He was giving voice to the secret terror every professional officer in the room had carried for months. The Sixth Army is bled white in Stalingrad. Its flanks are hanging in the air, protected by forces that will not and cannot hold. If we do not immediately order a strategic withdrawal, a contraction of the front, a shortening of our lines, we risk not a setback, but an encirclement of apocalyptic proportions. We must retreat from the Volga. We must pull Army Group A back from the Caucasus foothills. We must consolidate a defensible line before the winter. The word retreat acted on Hitler like a physical blow. His pale face flushed a blotchy red. Never! The scream was sudden, primal, tearing from his throat. I will not give up the Volga. I will not give up a single meter of German blood-soaked soil. The fight for Stalingrad is a battle of destiny. To retreat from there is to admit defeat to world history. He began to pace behind the table, his left arm jerking at his side. You speak of physics, Zeitzler. I speak of will. Did Frederick the Great have mathematics on his side at Leuthen? No, he had the will to prevail, and he did. We hold. We stand fast. Every man, every position. Festung Europa is built on German tenacity, not on slide rule calculations. He was spiraling into the familiar rant, but this time the generals did not lower their eyes in resigned submission. They watched him, and in their faces was not fear, but a kind of horrified pity. They were witnessing the commander-in-chief of the world's most technically advanced army reject the reality of mathematics, logistics, and enemy capability in favor of a fairy tale about Frederick the Great. The power struggle was over. It was no longer a debate between strategies, it was a collision between reality and psychosis, and in that bunker, psychosis held all the guns. Hitler's monologue escalated, transforming the briefing room into a sound chamber for his alternate reality. He jabbed a finger at the map, not at the vulnerable Don flank, but at the tiny dot of Stalingrad. The city is almost completely in our hands. The Russian is using the ruins as a fortress, but a fortress can be taken. Paulus needs more troops. He will get them. More ammunition. It will be sent. He turned his fury on the logistics reports. These supply figures are lies, concocted by defeatists in the Quartermaster Corps to sabotage the front. I demand a new audit, a National Socialist audit. He then unveiled his solution, a plan born entirely in the vacuum of his own mind, disconnected from the maps, the reports, the very war outside. The solution is not retreat, it is attack, a new offensive. He began to trace lines on the map with his finger, lines that passed through known concentrations of Soviet reserves, across rivers, through imaginary gaps. We will launch a secondary thrust from the Rzhev salient here to draw Russian reserves north. Then we will redeploy the SS Panzer Corps from France and use it as a spearhead to cut behind Stalingrad from the north. We will not retreat from the Caucasus, we will reinforce it. The mountain troops will have their supplies by air if necessary. It was a breathtaking spectacle of strategic dementia. The officers listened, stunned. The SS Panzer Corps was refitting in France and couldn't be moved for months. The Luftwaffe didn't have the transport capacity to supply an army in the mountains by air. An offensive from Rzhev was logistically impossible. He was playing a game of chess, moving pieces that did not exist on a board he had invented. Colonel General Jodl, the sycophant, saw his cue. "A brilliant conception, my Führer," he intoned, his voice devoid of any human inflection. "A double envelopment on a strategic scale. It would catch the Bolsheviks completely by surprise." Keitel nodded vigorously. The will of the Führer, applied with force, can overcome any material difficulty. But Zeitzler and Heusinger were trapped in the real world. Zeitzler tried once more, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and despair. "My Führer, the redeployment of the SS Corps would take a minimum of 8 weeks. The railway capacity does not exist. The troops in Stalingrad and on the Don do not have 8 weeks. They may not have 8 days. The Soviet offensive, when it comes, will not wait for our redeployments." Hitler stopped pacing. He leaned over the table, his face now inches from Zeitzler's. His breath was sour. His eyes were wide, unfocused, glistening with a terrible, fanatical light. "General Zeitzler," he whispered, the quiet more terrifying than the scream. "You are infected with the same poison as Halder, the poison of cowardice, the poison of the General Staff, which has always been against me. I gave you this position to be my strong right arm, not to bring me the weepings of the front. You will cease this talk of retreat. You will find a way to make the supplies move. You will instill in the army the fanatical will to hold. That is an order. Your only task now is to execute my will. Do you understand?" It was not a question. It was a verdict. Zeitzler looked into the eyes of his Führer and saw no reasoning mind, only an impervious wall of dogma. The professional soldier in him wanted to resign on the spot. The loyal National Socialist in him was shattered. He said nothing. He simply gave the smallest, barely perceptible nod. It was the nod of a man signing the death warrant for 250,000 men. The atmosphere in the room was no longer heavy, it was suffocating. The oxygen had been replaced by the cold, inert gas of absolute, irrational certainty. The argument didn't end with a bang, but with a slow, chilling deflation. After his whispered threat, Hitler straightened up and turned back to the map. He stared at the long, curved line of the Don, at the vulnerable symbols denoting Italian and Romanian divisions. He stared at the chaotic scribble of Stalingrad. He stared at the vast, empty spaces behind the German lines and the implied, menacing mass of red symbols building up on the Soviet side. Zeitzler, defeated, began gathering his damning reports. The other generals stood frozen, waiting for the dismissal. But Hitler did not dismiss them. He was silent for a full minute, a silence so profound they could hear the faint hum of the ventilation system and the thud of their own hearts. His earlier rage, the vibrating, performative fury, was gone. In its place was a terrible stillness. His eyes were no longer blazing with fanaticism. They were just tired, and deep within that tiredness, something new flickered, a moment of dreadful, unimpeded clarity. It was as if Zeitzler's facts, Heusinger's warnings, and the brutal arithmetic of the maps had finally bypassed the ideological filter and penetrated directly into the core of his understanding. He reached out a trembling hand and touched the map, right over the city of Stalingrad. Not a jab, but a touch. "Paulus," he said, the name barely a whisper. He wasn't speaking to anyone in the room. He was speaking to the map, to the ghost of the campaign. "He has how many men in the city itself?" Zeitzler, startled by the change in tone, answered automatically, from memory. "Approximately 250,000 men of the 6th Army and attached units, my Führer." "And their supplies," Hitler continued, still in that quiet, almost conversational tone. "If the If the Don front here, his finger traced the Romanian sectors, if it were to be broken, how long could they hold? The room was a tomb. This was the question they had all been avoiding. This was the heart of the catastrophe. Zeitzler answered, his own voice hollow. Without a secure land bridge across the Don, and with Soviet artillery controlling the Volga, the Sixth Army could be supplied only by air. Given the Luftwaffe's current transport strength and the predictable weather conditions from November onward, a matter of weeks, at best. Hitler nodded slowly, as if accepting a simple, unpleasant piece of information. Weeks, he repeated, not a shout, a confirmation. In that moment, it happened, the breaking point, the moment every officer present would later recall in their memoirs. Adolf Hitler, the man who had conquered Europe, who had dismissed generals and defied the world, realized he had lost the Eastern Front. You could see it in the sudden, complete sag of his shoulders, in the way the last vestige of color drained from his face, leaving it the gray of the concrete walls, in the way his eyes finally lost their focus on the map and stared into the middle distance, seeing not the arrows and symbols, but the abyss. He did not collapse. He did not weep. He simply stopped. The engine of his will, which had been running at a screaming, furious RPM for an hour, ceased. The fantasy of the secondary offensive, the redeployment of the SS, the airlift, all of it evaporated in the face of this simple, logistical truth. A matter of weeks. All the will in the world could not fuel transport planes that didn't exist or fly them through winter blizzards. He took his hand off the map. "Thank you, gentlemen," he said, his voice now flat, eerily calm, utterly empty. "The briefing is concluded. You will have my written orders in the morning." He turned and walked towards the door, his steps slow, deliberate, heavier than when he had entered. He did not look back. Heinz Guderian scrambled to open the door for him, and he disappeared into the darkened corridor, a solitary figure swallowed by the shadows of his own fortress. The men left in the room did not move. They did not speak. They were stunned, not by another outburst, but by its absence. They had just witnessed something far more terrifying than Hitler's rage. They had witnessed his silent, private surrender to a truth he could no longer deny. The most important emotional moment of the war in the East had just passed, not on a battlefield, but in a silent, well-lit room. The front was over. They all knew it. And now, so did he. The written orders, promised by that hollow voice, arrived at the General Staff quarters within hours. They were not a product of the night's grim realization, but a frantic, reactive denial of it. Hitler had emerged from his private quarters after his moment of clarity, not with a new strategic wisdom, but with a redoubled commitment to the old, disastrous dogma. The glimpse of the abyss had not made him cautious, it had made him defiant. His orders, issued in the cold light of dawn on September 9, 1942, sealed the fate of armies. 1. The stand-fast order for Stalingrad. The directive was absolute. The Sixth Army will continue the attack to secure the complete occupation of the city of Stalingrad. No unit, under any circumstances, is to be withdrawn from the Volga front. The city and its surroundings are to be held as a Festung, fortress. This order transformed an army from a maneuver force into a garrison, deliberately ignoring the lethal exposure of its flanks. 2. The denial of flank reinforcement. Requests from Army Group B to strengthen the Romanian and Italian sectors with German mechanized divisions were explicitly denied. Hitler's order stated, "Mobile reserves are not to be diluted for purely defensive tasks. The best defense of the Don flank is the continued, relentless offensive pressure on Stalingrad." It was a logic that inverted cause and effect, guaranteeing the flanks would crumble. 3. The diversion of resources. Instead of sending reinforcements to the critical Don front, Hitler ordered the preparation for the fantastical secondary offensive from the Rzhev salient, Operation Wirbelwind. Precious fuel, ammunition and railway capacity were now to be allocated to a non-existent offensive hundreds of miles from the coming crisis, based solely on his midnight intuition. 4. The dismissal of intelligence. A separate, secret order was sent to the SD, Security Service, and OKW, demanding an investigation into the defeatist and pessimistic reporting emanating from certain sections of the General Staff and frontline commands. Colonel Galen of Fremde Heer Ost was instructed to re-evaluate his estimates of Soviet reserves upward, but only marginally, ensuring the fiction of a weakened Red Army was maintained in future briefings. General Zeitzler, receiving these orders, did not protest again. He had seen the breaking point. He knew protest was useless. He summoned his aides and began, with the mechanical efficiency of a broken man, to translate the Führer's will into operational commands. He ordered the 6th Army to dig in deeper. He told the commanders on the Don that no reinforcements were coming. He initiated the pointless planning for Wirbelwind. As he signed the papers, his staff noted his face was a mask. He was following orders, but the light of conviction in his eyes, present just weeks before, was gone. He was now merely the clerk of the coming catastrophe. The other generals in the room, Jodl, Keitel, approved the orders without comment. Their faces, too, were not of men making military decisions, but of men performing a ritual, watching a script they knew ended in tragedy, but were powerless to alter. The decisions made that morning were not strategy, they were a death sentence, typed in triplicate and distributed across the front. The immediate aftermath of the midnight briefing was a quiet, creeping despair that infected the highest levels of the German war machine. Zeitzler's collapse. The energetic general who had entered the wolf's lair, intent on saving the front, began a rapid physical and mental decline. He worked 20-hour days, trying to perform the miracle Hitler demanded, but the strain was unsustainable. He became gaunt, irritable, and prone to sudden fits of despair. Within months, he would suffer a complete nervous breakdown, a living casualty of the moral injury inflicted that night, the injury of knowing the truth and being forced to act against it. The ghost of Guderian's fury. When news of the stand-fast orders and the dismissal of flank concerns reached General Heinz Guderian, now in enforced retirement, he reportedly threw a map against the wall of his study. "The fools," he was said to have raged to his wife. "They are sacrificing an entire army to his vanity. They are doing exactly what the Russians want them to do." His frustration was the frustration of the entire sidelined professional officer corps, watching their life's work be destroyed by a single man's delusion. The morale of the Wehrmacht. While the rank and file did not know of the specific briefing, the orders that trickled down spoke volumes. The seasoned frontline officers and NCOs, who could read a tactical situation, understood what fortress orders and denied withdrawals meant. A fatalistic cynicism began to replace aggressive confidence. Letters home became more somber. The term Halbordnung, half-order, entered the lexicon, meaning an order that was given but which everyone knew was impossible to execute and would lead to ruin. The army's nervous system was going numb. The Soviet spring coils tight. Unbeknownst to the Germans, the very night of their fraught briefing, Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov and Chief of Staff Alexander Vasilevsky were in the Kremlin, presenting Stalin with the final draft of Operation Uranus, the double envelopment plan designed to trap the German 6th Army in Stalingrad by smashing through the very Don flanks Zeitzler had begged Hitler to reinforce. Soviet reconnaissance had confirmed the weakness of the Allied armies. The trap was set. The German High Command, by its own decision in that midnight meeting, had now walked into it with its eyes wide open. The downfall of the Eastern Front did not begin with a Soviet tank attack. It began with the metallic click of a bunker door closing behind a defeated dictator, and the sound of his generals left in the silent room, not speaking because there was nothing left to say. The midnight briefing was closed. The orders were issued. The machine, now set on a catastrophic course, continued to grind forward. In his private quarters, Adolf Hitler did not sleep. He sat in an armchair, a single lamp illuminating the same situation map now pinned to his wall. He stared at it, not as a commander looking for solutions, but as a man staring at the scene of an accident that has already happened. The tremor in his hand was more pronounced. The moment of clarity in the briefing room had passed, walled up again behind ramparts of denial and blame, but the crack it had made in his certainty remained. He would never again speak of a quick victory in the East. From this night forward, the talk would be of fanatical resistance, of fortresses, of holding on until mythical wonder weapons could turn the tide. The war of conquest was over. The war of stubborn, nihilistic defense had begun. Down the hall, in the officers' mess, Generals Zeitzler and Heusinger sat with cups of cold coffee. They did not discuss the briefing. They did not discuss the orders. Finally, Heusinger, his voice barely audible, gave words to the unspoken truth that now governed their lives and the fate of their army. "It is over," he said, not looking at Zeitzler. "We can maneuver, we can delay, we can make them pay for every meter, but we cannot win in the East anymore, not after tonight." Zeitzler said nothing. He just stared into his cup. His silence was confirmation. Beyond the barbed wire and minefields of the Wolfsschanze, beyond the dark East Prussian forest, along the banks of the distant Volga and Don, 250,000 men prepared for another day of brutal fighting, unaware that their strategic fate had just been irrevocably sealed in a room far away. The dawn that broke on September 9th, 1942, did not bring a new day of hope for the German offensive. It illuminated the first day of the end. The secret midnight briefing was not where a battle was planned. It was where a war was lost. The Eastern Front would rage for another 2.5 years, consuming millions more lives in its fiery retreat. But the essential turning point, the moment the inevitable outcome became locked in place, happened not with the roar of cannons at Kursk, nor the final storming of Berlin. It happened in the quiet, desperate, and ultimately futile confrontation between hard facts and unshakable fantasy in a bunker at midnight. This was the night Germany truly lost the East.